Saturday, December 8th, 2018. I'm Justin Castelli. This is All About Your Benjamins, and this is your weekly mixtape and weekend review. Not a lot of exciting news this week, but I am pretty excited about this week's episode because this is the first weekend review video that will also be broadcast on the new RLS Wealth Management Alexa flash briefing skill. So if you have an Echo or any of the devices that run Alexa, be sure to add RLS Wealth Management's flash briefing skill to your list so you can stay up to date with these weekly mixtape and weekend review videos that will now be broadcast and other things that will be going on throughout the week. So with that being said, let's get into the news, and we can get through this pretty quickly so you can head to your weekend. We're going to begin with some news that occurred midweek. The very first topic of last week's weekend review with Roman and Leo and Silas, we talked about President George H.W. Bush passing away. Well, he was laid to rest this week, and he had numerous ceremonies throughout the week. I was not a big history buff growing up, but I did learn a lot about his past and his history with all the articles and specials that were done. And I just want to note that I thought it was very impressive and enjoyed the stories about his military history, his experience in the military. So if you didn't hear any of those, be sure to go check those out. There's plenty of articles out there, but I really enjoyed reading those and his quest to get into the military and everything behind that. So that was the topic I wanted to start with this week, just the laying to rest of President George H.W. Bush. Diving into some economic news, we had some employment numbers out this week. The hiring levels, the rate of hiring slowed in November. Now it did not stop. We're still growing the jobs, but it was not at high of a rate as they thought and anticipated, and they being the analysts who don't really know, and these numbers they pick are just totally random. But nonetheless, there's expectations, and we were under those. There were 155,000 new jobs in the month of November. And some of the blame for why the hiring slowed was just on a tight labor market. And we've talked about this throughout the course of the year as far as where labor markets were, what hiring means, why the Fed is watching that, what that could mean for inflation. So the labor market remains tight, which is good for wages, and we're seeing wages continue to go up. Keeps a little bit of concerns for inflation that the Fed is watching. Another thing that they've talked about, and they being the analyst, is that there's not enough skilled workers for the open jobs. So that there are millions of jobs open, but employers are having a hard time finding people qualified for those positions. Some of me wonders if that is lip service, and some of me wonders if that's true. Having a wife who has a small business, I know that it is, she has great employees, but it's hard sometimes to find people to fill certain positions, and talking to other business owners. So I do think there is some validity that the workers that are desired for some of these positions are either not looking for the jobs or just not out in the market at the time being. Unemployment stayed at 3.7%, so that was the same as previous month. And a new number that we will kind of look at is the unemployed and underemployed number. We've never talked about this before, but that ticked up to 7.6%. And basically what that number is, that is the unemployed plus those who aren't kind of really working, they're kind of out of the workforce but not totally given up, and then those that might be stuck in a part-time job. So that number ticked up to 7.6%. I will try to kind of continue to monitor that as the hiring comes into these weekend review videos. But unemployment's at 3.7. When you add in those other categories of workers, we're up to 7.6%. So that is your report on the hiring and the employment numbers. We've talked about oil the last 2 weeks and touched on it earlier in the year as well. OPEC and some of the other major players decided that they are going to be cutting oil production. So the thought is that if you cut the oil production, supply and demand comes into play, and that might help stabilize the prices. Me being the consumer, me not being in oil, I am selfish and like to see the oil prices going down because that means gas prices go down and I have more money in my pocket to go out and buy Christmas gifts. But we don't want that going too far down because that impacts other areas of the market. And part of the U.S. economy is tied to oil. So again, OPEC, Russia, other major players are cutting their oil production for the time being to help stabilize that price falling. Federal Reserve, we've talked about them a lot. No major news coming out of them other than just some language and some articles and some comments coming out of the Fed about maybe going into 2019 with a wait-and-see, more dovish approach. So we've talked about dovish and hawkish of what that means and what the Fed's plans are. Personally, and I'm not any more in the know than anybody else, I think that the Fed still raises rates in December. I don't necessarily have any issue with them going into 2019, reevaluating the current landscape, changing their language, and maybe not committing to raising as many times as they did, or as many times as they had planned, just to see what happens. I don't think wait and see is a bad language. One of the things that we've talked about before, and I'll just bring up again, I think it's interesting how for years we wanted to see the Fed raise rates because that meant that the economy was strong. You know, coming out of the great financial crisis, they lowered rates to kind of help boost the economy. The commentary always was, well, we want the Fed to raise rates because that signals that the economy is strong. And here we are, the Fed is raising rates, the economy appears to be strong, and now all of a sudden them raising rates is a bad thing. You can never win with the market. Good news becomes bad news becomes good news, the markets react crazy. Just an interesting dynamic, so that's why I try to stress not to put too much weight behind headlines, because you never know how the market, how analysts are going to receive that news. And again, we're long-term investors, at least my clients, and I think majority of the people who come to All About Your Benjamins are long-term investors. We're not traders, so these short-term moves, these short-term commentaries should not be impacting what you're doing. And that is a perfect tie-in to one more topic, but I have one thing I want to get to beforehand as I check my board. Quietly, Congress passed a temporary spending bill. I had no idea that we were at that time of the year. I don't really pay attention to that, but we were at the time of the year where we go with budgets not being passed and government shutdowns. Well, they passed a 2-week patch to keep Congress running for the next 2 weeks, avoiding a shutdown, to continue to debate on whether or not to fund the wall on the southern border. So I would not be surprised if this comes up into the news going into the end of the year. I would imagine that with everything going on in DC, it's kind of good to keep that budget stuff going and not have a shutdown, because you add that with everything else, could be some issues. And then finally, the markets maintain their volatile and shaky behavior. This week we had a lot of volatility. We had big down days, big up days, big recovery days to end up flat. So the market is just kind of not sure where to go right now with all this news coming out of tariffs and oil and CFO of the Chinese company being arrested in Canada. A lot of news out there driving the markets, a lot of uncertainty. So going into the end of the year, maybe we have volatility rather than the Santa Claus rally that everybody's looking for. There are talks of a bear market, and I just wanted to address that. Hindsight is 2020. We don't have that hindsight to know if we may have already started a bear market, but I wanted to take this as a moment to just remind you that if you have a financial plan, if you have an investment strategy tied to that financial plan, if we go into a bear market, if we are already in a bear market, you probably don't need to be making any major adjustments because your plan accounts for ebbs and flows in the markets. So do not react to commentary about bear markets. If you have questions, reach out to your advisor, talk about how you're situated, what's the game plan if this is the case, do you need to make any changes to spending or saving or whatever it might be. But I think a lot of times we hear bear markets, we think 2008. Not every bear market goes to a 2008 great financial crisis. Bear markets are normal parts of the market cycle, and we don't know until after the fact, or at least till we're midway through, whether or not we're actually in one. So I don't think you should worry about trying to predict or make adjustments to it. Again, if you have a plan directing your investment policy, chances are you can stick with that. Well, that is it for this week's weekly mixtape and weekend review. If you're listening on Alexa, head on over to allaboutyourbenjamins.com to check out all of the mixtape blog posts below. Same thing if you're watching on YouTube, head to All About Your Benjamins. Check those mixtape blog posts out. They're pretty good this week. And if you are listening on Alexa, thank you very much. Hopefully I didn't set her off too much if you're watching this on YouTube. But thank you. If you're not, subscribe, check it out. I'm going to have a lot of fun with these flash briefings throughout the week, and we will let you get to your weekend. So thanks for watching, thanks for following. Don't forget to subscribe to everything. Have a great weekend, and we'll see you in the next episode.